Yes, and we will welcome a Q&A at the end of the presentation, which will be as follows. Markus Brunnermeier will start with a 30-minute presentation, followed by Fabio Natalucci and for 10 minutes, and then another 10 minutes with Gernot Wagner. And then we'll have room for Markus to come back to some of the discussion raised by Fabio and Gernot, but also your questions with some answers in the chat and verbally. So let's start. Markus, the floor is all yours. You have 30 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nicoletta. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks to all of you for coming and listening to my presentation. I would like to talk about my book, The Resilient Society. And the motivation of this book was actually the COVID crisis, when I gave a webinar series, organized a webinar series, and got a lot of feedback, and I wanted to bring it all under the common theme of resilience. And then the first question is, we have a lot of shocks we are facing, and we might be facing more shocks coming down the road. Of course, we had the COVID crisis, but we might have antibiotic resistance. We have more financial crises probably coming up, cyber attacks, natural disasters. And then there's a lot of new technologies with genetic modifications and other things which come with uncertainties we don't even foresee yet. And on top of that, typically crises don't come alone, they come in pairs or triplets. So it's really important that we find a theme, to find a way to bounce back. And the first thing I would like to figure out is, what is actually resilience? What's the difference to robustness or just avoiding risk? What redundancies do we need, and so forth? So the first thing, actually, what the book does, it just identifies what resilience is and what it is not. So just I call it the cousins of resilience. And one of the cousins is robustness. Robustness means you withstand any shock, or you're fault tolerant. So most of the shocks you can just block, whether they're known or unknown shocks. And resilience is different. Resilience means you might face a shock, but you can bounce back. So it's a different concept than robustness. It's all about bouncing back. So you react to a shock rather than standing rigid. It's not about stability through rigidity. It's really stability through flexibility. And what is the disadvantage of robustness is that you can stand a certain number of shocks, but there's always a robustness barrier. If the storm is too strong, then essentially you break through the robustness barrier, and then you can't bounce back anymore. So I try to use in the introduction the story of La Fontaine, who compares the oak with the reed, where the oak is very rigid and withstands most winds, but if the storm is very, very powerful, the oak falls over and can't come back up. And while the reed is constantly bending, seems always volatile, and seems actually much more risky than the oak, it's actually always coming back even after the strongest storm. And in the story of La Fontaine from the 17th century, he says, or the reed says, I bend, I bow, but I do not break. And it's also related to something I've worked earlier within the financial context, which is the volatility paradox. Something which seems very rigid and very low volatile might at the end be much less sustainable or less stable, because once there's a huge shock, you can't bounce back. And something which is more volatile and bounces back all the time and bounces back and forth is actually much more stable down the road. And there's also an element, if you're exposed to little crises, little shocks all the time, you learn how to react to this crisis, and you can also then withstand some bigger crises. It's a little bit like the human immune system, where if you live in a very sterile environment, you're never exposed to anything, and then you have a little bacteria coming or virus coming, it knocks you over, but you're constantly exposed to some bacteria, then actually you can much better sustain when a crisis comes. So that's essentially the basic idea. So the basic thing is, resilience is not robustness, and it requires a different institutional framework to have a resilient framework rather than a robustness framework. The other thing is, resilience does not mean you should avoid the risk at any cost. Actually, risk is quite different from resilience. Risk is a static concept. It's about the variance or the standard deviation. Resilience is a dynamic concept. It's like you're hit by a shock and then you come back. So it's about the mean reversion of it. So here I have an impulse response curve depicted here in form of a fan chart to reflect the uncertainty from how quickly the recovery will occur. But it's all about the dynamic thing bouncing back. So indeed, actually, it might be then if you have a resilient strategy, the ability to bounce back allows you to take more risk and you will be better off in the long run. So what I've depicted here are two paths. One is riskless, so you avoid any risk, but it comes at a cost, so the growth rate will be lower. While you have the other one, which is always subject to shocks, looks like business cycles, if this is on a log scale here, and then you bounce back. So you have set up the economy or the society in a way that it can bounce back after some shocks. Then in the long run, you will be much better off going for the more risky world as long as resilience is guaranteed. If you don't have resilience, then you should not go for the riskies. So rather than this classifying worlds in risky or less risky, we should actually classify the world, whether it's resilient or not resilient, whether you can be bouncing back. And if you have the ability to bounce back, you can go for more risky environments, and it gives you an advantage. So we have to look at what are really the resilience destroyers. What destroys resilience? And typically what destroys resilience are if you fall into traps. So if you fall in a trap, you face a shock and then you're trapped. Be a poverty trap, be a middle income trap, or there are many, many traps. There are no points of return. And that's really dangerous. So we have to look out for the risks which are associated with traps. We also have to look for risks which are associated with feedbacks, some adverse feedback loops where it's hard to come back. So feedback's even worse. You might actually spiral out of control in these circumstances. And then there's something we have to look at, which are tipping points, where I've depicted here a little figure here. You drift down here and then you hit the tipping point and then you spiral out of control because of feedback loops. And that comes often in climate change and natural disasters. You have these tipping points. Often we don't know where the tipping point is. But a classic example is if the Gulf Stream were to dry up, then you cannot switch on the Gulf Stream anymore if you change the climate. So there's a tipping point. So we have to be very careful not to reach tipping points. So all of these traps, feedbacks, and tipping points, these are resilience destroyers. And that's when we do risk analysis. That's what we should look for, not purely the risk on its own. Now, what is the connection of resilience and sustainability? Because we will talk with Gernot and others also about climate aspects. The resilience is actually part of sustainable aspects. So if an economy or a society is not resilient, then it's not sustainable. But sustainability is actually more than resilience. So it requires resilience, but it also requires that there's no adverse trend. So here, for example, I have a similar picture again. It's a resilient thing, but it could be, if the trend is going downhill, like this dashed line here, it would not be a sustainable path because, it leads in the wrong direction. So resilience, sustainability requires resilience and that there's no adverse trend. And of course, if there's, it could be like you avoid risk, so you have an adverse trend. So you could argue there's resilience on this dashed line here, but if you might hit a tipping point, so it's actually better to go for the risky path with resilience, and that might help you to get away from the tipping point. So that's essentially, in some circumstances, actually going for more risk is actually ultimately better because it avoids tipping points. And this is a particular example I've depicted here. So it's quite, just simply looking at risk is actually quite misleading. One really has to look at the resilience can be quite different from risk on its own. Now, there's an additional dimension to the resilience. There's also a term structure of resilience. There might be a dynamic trade-off. So there might be a way of doing policy where you actually bounce back more quickly, but it has then the drawback in the long run, it makes you more vulnerable to the next shock, falling into traps or feedback loops or tipping points. So there's also a term structure of resilience to think about these things. And that comes then into play when we set up what are the optimal institutional arrangements. And that was part of the title of the talk today. What's the optimal institutional arrangement? It might be that we do something very quickly to bounce back very quickly, but that makes us vulnerable to the next shock much more. And that how much flexibility do you want to put into place, because it helps you to bounce back very quickly, but it limits your credibility and communication tools because you limit the commitment power down the road if you have too much flexibility. And this might build up then some dangers down the road. So there's a dynamic trade-off as well one has to keep in mind. And that, to manage this dynamic trade-off, it's important to have the right institutional framework in mind. Now, this leads me already to the next point. there's resilience at different levels. And there are a lot of books written in psychology about resilience of individuals. You know, you can train yourself to bounce back more easily and, you know, have some human capital and set up your psychological environment this way. There can be resilience of a system, like you have redundancies to make the network more resilient or the global value chain more resilient. Buffers, you know, for example, make the bank and the financial system more resilient. And a lot of these insights we have learned from the global financial crisis, like stress tests on banks and the financial system, we can also apply to global value chain. So there's a lot of insights we have learned from the financial crisis, which makes the financial system more resilient. We can actually employ for other systems as well. The book focuses very much on the society, so resilience of a society. And what makes the resilience of a society more interesting is, of course, you need individual resilience, but it's all about interaction between individuals and how, you know, they amplify things and makes things worse or try to avoid these feedback loops and all that. And let me just go into something which I think is very important, what I call these feedback externalities. So these are externalities combined with, if I use the economic lingo, strategic complementarities. So that's essentially here depicted here is a person A. The person A does something and that causes a negative externality on person B. So there's a classic externality. That's bad on its own. We know externalities we have to correct because of market failures. But then the person B is reacting in a particular way. That's because of, let's say, strategic complementarities is also doing something which causes a feedback back to person A. And then person A is reacting again to that. And that you lead to a feedback loop and makes things even worse. So if you have externalities, negative externalities, combined with feedback effects, which amplifies then this up, further and further, that actually is the most dangerous thing you can have. And this you have at the society level, where you have externalities and responses to these externalities. And that's what you have to keep in mind. And for this, we need an institutional framework to make the social contract in such a way to avoid these feedback externalities, in particular these feedback externalities. A social contract can be done simply in social norms, so there's no law written, but it's just commonly understood and enforced by the people on their own. It can be enforced by laws, by the government, or also certain market arrangements, which make sure that we don't get in these feedback loops and these feedback externalities. Now, what the book does, it goes more into social contract, but it does it very much from an economist's perspective. And, you know, it's more like Tom Hobbes than John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And it argues that the social contract is there to limit two forms of externalities. One is the externalities from others, the standard ones. Some other members of society do something, cause an externality on me, push me in a trap or something like that. That's what the social contract has to limit. And then the social contract should also provide some insurance for shocks. And I call these shocks externalities from Mother Nature. So in a sense, from an abstract perspective, shocks are also externalities. They're not caused by other people, they're caused by nature. And for this, we would like to have some insurance as well, like John Rawls argues in The Veil of Ignorance, ex ante, we provide some insurance for that. Resilience is slightly different from insurance because it also emphasizes that people can bounce back. So when somebody suffers a shock, I help him to bounce back, but I don't just simply throw money at him. I give him the ability, I reskill him or something to bounce back. So in order to preserve, I think what's really important, the dignity of people. Just throwing money at people, it doesn't give you the dignity. So there's some, of course, you have to help out with money as well, but there might be some other help which allow people, together with their own effort, to bounce back more easily. One important element in this, social contract to shocks or externality from Mother Nature is the diversity of society. If a society is very diverse, actually, most of the shocks are more idiosyncratic. So they're different from different parts of society. And then it's easier to insure. So idiosyncratic shocks we can more easily insure. So diversity is actually good for having better insurance. But we know from Alesina's work and others' work that if the society is more homogeneous, the willingness of society to help each other out is much bigger. So there's a tension there. On the one hand, you would like to have a very diverse society in order to have people in parts of society having different shocks. On the other hand, you would like to have a homogeneous society because the willingness of the people to help each other is much more pronounced. So what I do then is I take that and apply this to different settings. So how does resilience have? So the big message essentially is that unlike in robustness, you have to have some redundancies and buffers. So you can't just not have everything extremely lean without any buffers and any redundancies. So redundancies are not bad necessarily. They might be very useful. They're there for crisis times. But the big difference between robustness and resiliency is that for robustness, you have for each shock, you have a particular redundancy devoted to this particular shock. For resilience, you might have fewer redundancies, but very flexible ones, which you can easily redeploy. And so the idea is that you might be facing a shock, you don't know even what the shock is, and I think most of the shocks we won't be able to foresee. You are hit by the shock, and you take it. You occasionally will be hit by a shock, but you have some redundancies which you can redeploy such that you can fight back and bounce back much more quickly. So it's not, the aim is not to block any shock and undo any shock right away. The aim is to come back after something. And this means you need fewer redundancies compared to robustness. I would also argue that robustness you cannot really achieve. It's unrealistic and it's illusionary. What you really can do is you have some very flexible buffers and redundancy. You can redeploy whatever the shock is, and then you bounce back more flexibly. So one is the redeployability, and the other one is this flexible response. So you have to be agile. The society has to be willing to adjust and be agile. You should be allowing mavericks to be in society. So you shouldn't be, very one-sided. Everybody thinks the same way. So you promote mavericks and people who think differently to react more quickly to whatever the crisis might be. So about this redeployability, I often use the picture of a skyscraper. Or you can have a skyscraper which is going with the wind, and then you balance and bounce back. You can also build a skyscraper which is very rigid and doesn't move at all, but then you need so much on redundancies that the skyscraper becomes too heavy and it will break down on its own weight. Okay, so that's a little bit the difference to robustness, and you see already robustness is indeed not a viable thing to do. Now, what the book does, perhaps I jump to the next slide and come back to this one. It really is, the outline of the book is the following, that the first part talks about society and resilience, and I gave you a taste for the first part. The second part of the book has several chapters which goes through health management and the COVID crisis in particular. And there are 4 key elements of resilience, and I just would like to emphasize one element, which is the simultaneous approach, on the one hand to contain the crisis, on the other hand to develop a new normal, to bounce back to. And if you look at certain countries, they're really, zero COVID, they were very aggressive in managing the COVID crisis, but they didn't develop a new normal to bounce back. So the new normal essentially is the vaccine to bounce back and come back to a new situation. But of course, there's a big debate then on, there might be some spillover benefits from the innovation of new vaccines and all that, and how to design vaccines, or how many to run in parallel in order to have resilience, what types of vaccines to develop in parallel, and so forth. So all of that's the part 2 of the book. The part 3 of the book is all about macro resilience. It's about the macro economy. It's about, does COVID boost innovation? There's this QWERTY problem I discussed where you're stuck, let's say from working at home, you're stuck in a social, it's not, gives you a stigma if you work at home, and suddenly COVID pushes you out of this local equilibrium and go to another equilibrium. And in this sense, it is an innovation boost, and there's a lot of innovation coming out of the COVID crisis. On the other hand, you have some scarring effects, and this debate is essentially a whole chapter on that. I go into financial whipsaw, where in the financial March 2020, everything collapsed, and then it bounced back dramatically at the record height, as we see, if you look at bond issuance, sovereign debt, all this, it whips out dramatically back. We have this huge public debt across the globe, and we have to see how we will be able to handle this public debt coming up. And there's also an inflation whip. So initially we had this huge deflation, now we have the inflation, and it's debated, how this inflation whipsaw will play out. And then the final part of the book is dedicated to the global resilience in the global economy. It's a special chapter on the emerging markets, developing economies. It's, the poverty trap, middle income trap, and all these aspects. It goes then very much into geopolitics, China, US aspects, the world order, the global finance, the importance of swap lines and IMF, SDRs, and all these aspects you probably know very, very much in detail. And then in the trade aspects, the value chains, global value chains, how to make them more resilient and so forth. And then there's a whole chapter dedicated to climate change and what's specific about climate change, also related to what I mentioned with respect to sustainability. But the overarching thing then is to use that and apply these for various policy measures. Like for health, I mentioned already vaccines to the return to the new normal. In macro chapters, it's discussed to a large extent. The low interest rate environment actually gives more policy space and more resilience on the fiscal side, but it gives you less resilience on the monetary side. Now, because you're closer to zero or effective lower bound, there's less policy space, so you have less resilience there. But if the real interest rate is so low, you have more space on the fiscal side. If you think about finance, what gives you resilience there is if you have a very efficient debt restructuring mechanism. Okay, that avoids debt overhang problems. You can get rid of the debt overhang problems. You can bounce back. If you don't have an efficient debt restructuring mechanism, be it at the country level or international level, you suffer debt overhang problems and you don't bounce back. Alternatively, you can also build some capital requirements. Now, that's an alternative to a good debt restructuring mechanism. If you think about international or emerging economies, flexible exchange rate is a way to have more resilience because weakening the exchange rate helps you to bounce back, provided that you have enough macro-prudential regulation in place beforehand and don't have dollar-denominated or foreign-denominated debt outstanding. Again, building up foreign exchange reserves is another way to go for that, and there's a debate on these issues. You can do about distributed ledger technologies. What are the roles there? There's resilience if part of the network breaks down, other parts can take it up. There's a big debate on global value chains, from moving from just in time to just in case. Do we want to have stress tests? What we have developed, lessons from the global financial crisis, also for global value chains. What do we want, just stress test and indicate then to the companies or require them to do stress tests to make sure that we have a more robust system. There's a debate on the global geopolitics, the role of the dollar together with the swap line arrangements on the global scale. And as I mentioned before, there's the climate change chapter about avoiding tipping points and sustainability as being consisting of resilience plus no adverse trends. So all of this is put together. And of course, let me conclude. I can just give you a little whet the appetite to read the book, because it's very hard to convey all the information which are in 300-400 pages in a few minutes. But I hope it excites you to learn more about the concept of resilience. And I think the concept of resilience, and in particular, from a societal perspective, the society can be at the local level, on a village level, can be city, can be a nation society level, but also the global society. And all of these aspects are important to cover. And I think resilience will stay with us. And I think we haven't emphasized it enough in our economic analysis. We often assume in economic models, we go back to stationary models, and stationarity implicitly assumes you go back, you bounce back. But I think we have to have a deeper understanding what helps us to bounce back. And the book tries to open this a little bit, and in particular, relating and drawing from the lessons I've learned also from many, many other economists from the webinar series I've organized before. Thanks again for giving me this opportunity. I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much, Markus. This was very illuminating, and I'm sure you definitely have stimulate a lot of people to go and, get more informed about the concept of resilience, which is to some extent is always existed for a long time as a word, but it's been becoming vogue, I think, probably more close to the global financial crisis and being used a lot in the year post-crisis, especially this large crisis that we are living these years. I would like to move on to invite Fabio and Natalucci to discuss some of these concepts, the book. Fabio is a Deputy Director of the Monetary and Capital Markets Department at the IMF. He is responsible for the Global Financial Stability Report that gives the IMF's assessment of global financial stability risks, so the concept of risks coming back. Prior to joining the IMF, Fabio was a Senior Associate Director in the Division of Monetary Affairs of the Federal Reserve Board and Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Financial Stability and Regulation at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Fabio, you have 10 minutes to present your views, and you can start doing it now. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicoletta. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to discuss Markus' book. And that was a great opportunity to actually carve out some time to actually read a book without having an official excuse not to be bothered by other work. So I particularly appreciated that opportunity. It also was a fun book to read, so I really enjoyed reading it. When I joined the fund about 4 years ago, one of the first asks from Tobias Adrian, the financial counsel, was like, can you think about how we want to, in a more structural, analytical way, think about financial stability risk? And so the way we approached this was trying to separate the concept of shocks, which has something we cannot foresee. In fact, in the financial stability report, we did not foresee COVID. So I'm very glad not to be in the business of forecasting shocks. But think about vulnerabilities, both cyclical vulnerability as well as structural vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities as an amplifier, so the ability of the financial system essentially to absorb shock. And that concept is very much close to the issue of resilience that Markus has been discussing in the book. And then the outcome, which is in our case like growth risk and financial quantification of financial stability risk. But the concept of resilience is very much at the center while we look at financial stability issues. So what I thought I could do is maybe focus on the macro resilience part of the discussion of the book and trying to use this concept of resilience, trying to look backward and forward in some sense, right? So how was COVID different from the GFC through the lenses of resilience? And what can we think about future resilience though, coming out of COVID? So I think looking backward, there are probably three main differences between the GFC and the COVID shock. One is the nature of the shock, right? So one was a financial shock, hit the center of the financial system, hit the banking sector, and from there propagated to the other corner of the financial sector to the real economy with a global dimension. COVID is not a financial shock, and you can say it did not originate in the system, financial system. It's a real shock, if you want. With global implication, it did impact the financial sector, but allows you also to highlight the resilience of the financial sector in a different way. And that's my second point, which is the system came out of the GFC much more resilient in terms of like looking at bank, for example, bank capital, liquidity provision, some of the interconnectedness has been reduced, although that opened up Pandora's box because some of this risk moved to another part of the financial system, right? The non-bank financial intermediation sector. So the system was much more resilient this time when the shock hit than it was at the time of GFC, in part thanks to the policy regulatory reforms that have been put in place. And the third difference, I think, is the policy response. In terms of, when I say policy here, I include monetary, fiscal, and then financial policy response, right? So in terms of monetary policy, was faster, way faster than it was back then. I think there was a playbook in place that we are allowed to use, but also the magnitude was much larger, right? So look at the asset on the top 4 central banks of Fed, BOE, Bank of Japan, ECB, increased from like 35% to north of 60% of GDP of those countries. And it happened very quickly in a narrow window of time. And that number probably underestimated the extent of support because there were more measures, like if you look at the Fed, for example, liquidity facility, the take-up was low, but they were there, and that helped. Fiscal policy is another major difference, I think, that we have seen now versus back in 2008. And I think that helped in terms of redistribution effect of the shock itself, and I'll come back to it. And then the financial policy response. We had a number of measures that have been put in place post-GFC. So I think that allowed the V-shaped recovery of the V-shaped dynamic that Markus was focusing that we have seen this time vis-a-vis the GFC. Now, so the system clearly was more resilient. I think the main question is, as we navigate COVID, will the system be more resilient going forward? That's where I think we want to ask this question, whether in some sense what has been done policy-wise will help make the system more resilient and ready for the next shock or not. And I think the concept that it's useful here is this Markus term structure of resilience concept, right? So essentially think about the policymaker face an intertemporal trade-off between sustaining the economy today, so providing support, extending its support as much as possible to get out of the at the risk, but avoiding what we call legacy vulnerabilities, essentially scarring that will make the system less resilient when there is another shock, because eventually there will be another shock, right? This is how it is worked. And so I'm going to focus on a few issues to think about this intertemporal trade-off. One is monetary policy. And so what are the unintended consequences of more extraordinary measures that have been put in place, right? So one place to look at is pricing of risk. We have been in 10-year plus of liquidity. This is affecting how some investors think about risk appetite. Sometimes you meet with people in the private sector, then there have been investors that have not really seen interest rate going up. They only know one direction. So that may affect the way they think about pricing of risk. Another one is the financial vulnerabilities, and this is the concept of scarring. Where do we see financial vulnerabilities that may be building up if there is another shock? Corporate sector, the banking sector, the posture of banks now, when fiscal policy will be removed, that will be another place to look. And then the non-bank financial intermediary sector. Asset management, a lot of the FSB focus has been now on the investment fund sector, whether the vulnerability has been fixed or not. And I think the answer is that a lot more work needs to be done there. Now, how do you do this without hampering financial innovation? I think that's the big question, right? Where the regulatory perimeter of the regulation should be in a way that you trading off in a acceptable way financial innovation vis-a-vis the safety or resilience of the system. Another question is like long-term rates. What are long-term rates? Is there a new normal? I think in the book you discussed the new normal. What is the new normal? So the question is, there was a lot of hopes coming out of this that there will be a new normal for interest rate, that because of public investment, infrastructure, including in climate, we'll be able to raise our star to a level of higher productivity. That will make the system more resilient because there will be more space if there's a need to ease monetary policy when the next shock comes. Now, there was some enthusiasm before the summer. I think if you look at now where real rates are at the long end, I think we sadly back into the low level that we knew before COVID. Right? If you look at the 1-year rate 10 years from now, which is sort of like a proxy for long-term nominal rate, that number is between 50 and 70 basis points below the Fed R-star. So it looks like markets are still not pricing in such a productive economic growth over the long run. Now, fiscal policy is another one, a big brief here. I mean, this issue of fiscal dominance versus monetary policy. We are in a new world. Can we really use QE going forward when the central bank owns such a large share of government debt? How much policy space is left? So those are questions that I think that the interaction between the two, it's something that has to be thought carefully going forward. The other important point is the inflation, I think. Where are we coming out of the GFC? We've seen a V-shaped in the market-based measure inflation expectation. Where are we headed? Are we finally coming out of the 10-year plus of GFC when inflation was missing and all central banks were looking for them? Or are we in a place where inflation is a different environment now? Central banks are looking at inflation dynamics, supply chain issues, and Markus has highlighted, but also energy crisis, right? Particularly in Europe and China, and the extent to which climate policies will interact with that impact, put inflationary pressure into the system. I think that's going to be one important place to look in terms of resilience. How the transition from brown to green, how's that going to work out in terms of resilience of the system, and where the trade-off is there in terms of like different sources of energies. Clearly, if inflation turns out to be more persistent than central banks seems to be anticipating at least a few months ago, the policy trade-off will be much more punitive, right? So this issue of intertemporal resilience, because they will be forced to react to inflation. By reacting today, it's not clear that the system would be made more resilient in that sense. And so that trade-off is going to be well visible today, maybe earlier than central bank were anticipating. And as a corollary of that, the new Fed central monetary policy framework, like the flexible average inflation targeting, it was meant to kind of make up for the past lack of inflation. Ironically, perhaps was put in place at the time with an eye on a different kind of world in mind, right? One where inflation was consistently below the inflation target. If we are in a place where inflation, in fact, is going to be higher than target because of energy pressure, because of bottleneck, consistent supply chain, being such a backward-looking framework, there's a lot of question how that we're going to be working out if we are in an environment where the new steady state is. And so markets are already testing central bank to see what the reaction function is. And then emerging markets, obviously, that's one of the places where I think the issue of less resilience today versus tomorrow, as they have less fiscal space, as they need to address some of the vulnerabilities like external vulnerabilities and external financing need. Then maybe to conclude, one point to make in terms of concluding, maybe question for Markus here would be the following. So as we think about how to ensure resilience from a policy perspective, right? Two issues. One is you talk about buffers. So we have built buffer into the banking system, right? So those buffers have not been used, if you want. And now we have done some work here at the fund thinking about what the reasons are. And since the answer is different for European versus US banks, maybe the issue with US is they don't have enough buffers. They run so efficiently, so lean, that there's no buffer that they can use. They want to use, even if you have some buffer from a profitability standpoint. For the European banks, maybe the issue is the complete opposite, that they built so much buffer and they're so close to the regulatory aspect of this that, yes, they have buffers to use, but the return on equity on the banking world in Europe is not there. It's not incentivizing them to use it. But how to make the buffer work? I think that's one question in terms of resilience of the banking system. Then the second and last question is on the macroprudential policy tools. When we think about this intertemporal trade-off, we often make the point you don't want to use monetary policy. There's two objectives, two tools, use macro-pro. We have them in the Global Financial Stability Report. We always have this recommendation on take early action, address pocket of vulnerabilities with macroprudential tools, do it early because there is a lag, and if you don't have them, develop them. There are examples of some central banks that actually have used them, for example, in housing, but they really have not worked as hoped. And so they are resorting to tighten the old way, tighten monetary policy. So what is the assessment here to ensure resilience? Do they work, this macroprudential policy tool? Do we have them? And if not, do we need to go back to the old recipe of just tightening monetary policy today? And now let's stop there.
Thank you, Fabio. That was a really thorough set of thoughts and some good questions for Markus. Before Markus replies, I would like to pass the floor to Gernot. Gernot Wagner teaches climate economics at New York University. He writes the Risky Climate column of Bloomberg Green, and he's the author, among others, of Climate Shock with Martin Weitzman that was published in 2016, and most recently of Geoengineering the Gamble, published by Polity. Gernot, can you tell us what you think and share with us some of your views about Markus' resilience work? Thanks.
Thank you. I'm happy to. And as you can tell from Nicoletta's introduction, right, climate. I'll be talking about climate. So it's all I know, all I can do. A few thoughts. So first of all, let me just echo Fabio's thanks. And right, so it's always good to be a formal discussant because you are in fact forced to read the book and then, formulate some thoughts while reading with, a pencil in hand and so on and so forth. So thank you. Let me maybe sort of start with the harshest point first and then, keep backpedaling from there. And maybe the way to start this, to lessen the blow a little bit, is to talk about an entirely different book. We all think we're all familiar with the book Nudge, right? Richard Thaler, Cass Sunstein, and again, climate guy here, right? So what do I do when I read the book Nudge? I look for the climate chapter, and lo and behold, there is a climate chapter. If you happen to remember from leafing through Nudge how long the climate chapter is, I won't make you guess now, but the first iteration, the first version of the book had like a page and a half, literally, right? So it's a book, right? 200 pages, lots of different topics, flies in urinals, all sorts of stuff, right? Veggies first in the cafeteria, fantastic ideas going well beyond the flies and the veggies, right? But then you go to what I would consider one of the bigger problems out there, and you get a page and a half, right? And frankly, actually, very honestly, Dick and Cass Sunstein in this chapter basically very honest about it and say, look, there are some real limits here. Okay, shift gears. My approach to reading Markus's book, you can guess. I search for climate. I go to the climate chapter. It is more than 1.5 pages, I'm glad to say, but it is like 2.5 pages, I believe, or 3 pages of climate. Now, not to just go by quantity, quality matters, absolutely, and right, plenty of other things apply too, but right, and in some sense, we can all fill in the blanks here. Actually, I would like to ask Markus, of course, to comment on that. But what I took away from this, and what, frankly, I think is one broader takeaway, that there are, in fact, some problems, and again, climate. So yes, I'll focus on climate here, that are, not beyond, not above, not fundamentally more important than therefore, right? Not at all. But there are certain characteristics which, to be clear, Markus calls out very directly, right? So things like feedback externalities, tipping points, the traps that he calls out, that in some sense simply apply more seemingly to something like climate. And not a macroeconomist here, so I will not pretend in an IMF seminar to talk about financial stability and macroeconomic stability here, but certain global concepts that are very much right in that exact same section of the book with climate were the concept, the conceptualization, the new framework. And to be clear, I very much commend Markus for developing this new framework of thinking about resiliency, building the resilient society, resilient infrastructure that will allow us to think about this trade-off of efficiency versus resiliency and so on more intelligently. But climate may well break that system, right? It may well be there are certain characteristics here, the feedbacks, the tipping points, and so on, that simply go beyond. Now, just to be clear, and maybe this is a bit of a confession perhaps, but let me just share a link with you. Not a very modest confession because I'm drawing you to my own website here, but right, so this is from June last year, 2020, right, when all of us were struggling with how to make sense of COVID. And yes, I wrote my share of op-eds at the time, right, all trying to link COVID to, in my case, climate. Newsflash, yes, of course. And yes, there are plenty of parallels. There truly are. Right, there's COVID is climate change on warp speed. What happens, right, years, centuries, millennia now happens within hours, days, weeks, and so on. And right, plenty of parallels, plenty of reasons to draw analogies, to use examples, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, yes, there are some core characteristics of climate, and another immodest plug here for my latest PNAS paper on precisely this. tipping points, right? Quantifying the economics of climatic tipping points, which are so massive, so daunting, so, you know, out there, breaking the system, if you will, that there is no simple conceptualization that says, oh, and here's the analogy with resiliency versus other things we know of, where climate is simply yet another application. Okay, so that's point one, right? So maybe for certain issues, and again, climate, that sort of conceptualization falls apart or reaches its limits. And of course, that's an open question, right? In how far? And to be clear, right? So Markus is certainly not the first or only one who sort of does this, right? So, you know, I'll mention another economist here now, Bob Pindyck, who is not here to defend himself as far as I know. But there's sort of these epic debates over the past decade and a half or so until a couple years ago between Marty Weitzman, now, of course, I drank the Marty Kool-Aid on this one, right? Versus sort of others, Bill Nordhaus, Bob Pindyck, on how to think about climate risk, how to think about climate uncertainty, and sort of a famous, infamous Bob Pindyck take on this, not using the same language, but very much the same concepts that feed into our discussion here today, is let's think of climate change as sort of multiple frequent events, maybe even, you know, Great Recession style events, sort of massive macroeconomic shocks, but let's look at them in small multiples. And when you do that, and when you sort of translate some of this low probability, high impact, fat tails, heavy tails, long tails type story into this concept, you limit the impact that these tail events could potentially have, even if you assume a large number of multiple events. And sort of at the limit, right, an infinite number of them, if you limit them in size, you still have a very different conceptual framework than what I would argue, I believe, and in this case now, you know, Marty Weitzman's sort of fat tails conceptualization of climate, what that version of the world would lead you to believe, right? So in some sense, Fabio mentioned this before on sort of, right, we are now better equipped to deal with the kind of event than we were 10 years ago, and because we have a playbook. Well, yes, that's exactly the idea, right? That resiliency, this making your institutions more resilient, works for the sort of events that come in small multiples, that, right, where historic extrapolation works, and so on and so forth. That concept doesn't work, falls apart, and of course Markus was very open, very honest, very direct about this, when it comes to the sort of tipping point that simply makes you fall off the proverbial cliff. Okay, maybe one quick last point along these lines, and this is now at the very end of Fabio's comments. He spoke about, right, efficiency versus resiliency, and of course that is sort of very much in the background of this entire discussion, and different approaches of different central banks. In the climate world, in the environmental world, there is, you know, this long-standing concept of sustainability, which very much echoes that idea. And again, very immodestly, let me share my very last link to my own website here. But this is actually sort of an ancient paper from a decade or so ago, 8 years or so ago. When one tries to make sense of sustainability in economic terms, at least to me, the sort of the most logical thing to jump to is precisely this dynamic efficiency concept, which very much echoes, you know, resiliency without using the term, that says, you know, it's one thing to be resilient to the one-off event and to have the buffer and to have the sort of insurance that, you know, this one event that might be out in the tails somewhere can be dealt with because we have reserves, we have a buffer, we are somehow equipped to deal with it. It's quite another to extrapolate, project forward, think about what sustainability, resiliency, I'm using these terms interchangeably now, means in this dynamic context, where I would say dynamic efficiency is very different from what we often conceive of the narrower definition of efficiency, where resiliency is very much baked into the very definition of efficiency, right? Where you can't argue that you are dynamically efficient if basically at every 10 years, sort of even in my relatively brief lifetime, right? Every 10 years, right? LTCM, late 2000s, now again, right? Every 10 years, there's a financial shock, apparently, that predictably comes once a decade, every decade, and then, oops, what just happened, right? Well, projected out decades, centuries, if you will, going back to climate, none of these things should be a surprise. And maybe the very definition of what we as economists, climate or otherwise, mean by the concept of efficiency needs to have this broader definition, which I think, and this of course is a question for Markus, his conceptualization of resiliency very much includes. So a resilient, efficient economy, dynamic efficiency as a concept ought to, and I guess that's my question, ought it include this broader sense of operating within certain frames? And yes, tipping points, climate might blow through that, but ought we expand this definition of efficiency not to talk about efficiency versus resiliency, but talk about dynamic efficiency in a much broader sense that makes room for this resilient concept as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Gernot. Again, new set of very insightful considerations for Markus. I would suggest we proceed with some reflections by Markus on these discussions, and then for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we move on. We have a few questions in the chat. I have one myself. So is that okay with you, Markus?
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks, Nicoletta. Thanks to Fabio, and thanks to Gernot for very nice points. So let me address hopefully most of them. So concerning Fabio's points, I would like to add some things and then address his questions. I totally agree with him that, you know, we were way faster in monetary policy speed to react. I mean, it was just fantastic how the Fed saved in March 2020 the global financial system. Without this reaction, you know, we had huge capital outflows from the emerging market economies, and then it came back significantly. And all these new facilities, the rate cut, and everything was just at lightning speed. And I think this was really very different from the global financial crisis. I would add to that, the fiscal policy was also way more aggressive, and I would not underestimate that. And I think one reason for that in the US, but also in Europe and in other countries, one reason for that was that there was the moral hazard considerations didn't play such a big role. So there was nobody to be blamed. Like in the Euro crisis, you blame some other countries for misbehaving before, and that's why we got into these troubles. Nobody was really blamed for the COVID, and that made it much easier to have a huge fiscal intervention. I like very much what you said about this financial regulation versus financial innovation, to keep the right balance on that. And what you said about the long-term interest rate being low. If the real interest rate is low, people criticize that. I think just imagine if it were high. What would we do now? We would have huge fiscal implications and troubles. So actually, we should be glad that the real interest rate is low. Holding ceteris paribus, holding the growth rate of the economy fixed. Of course, if the growth rate of the economy is much higher, then, but the fact that the R star is low allows a huge fiscal space and gives us much more resilience on that. And what I outline in the book is one reason is essentially the safe asset perspective. So we really have to understand the safe asset perspective in detail. And certain countries have a benefit on that. They issue a safe asset, and this allows them to keep the interest rate very low. And there's all this, US debt valuation puzzles. There's all this out there, which allows us to raises these questions: why is the US interest rate so low? And luckily, it is so low. Let's imagine it were just 300 basis points higher. I think we would be in big trouble. On the inflation side, I agree, but I think there's a big divergence that's always underestimated, and I think for the fund is particularly important. That the US can afford to go a little bit more risky on the inflation. I think they can just say we keep the inflation. If it goes wrong, inflation will jump up, and then later we rise it, and then there will be a little recession in the US. That's fine. I think it might be the optimal risk taking from the US perspective. But for the emerging economies, that's really dangerous, because it will lead immediately huge capital flight out of the emerging economies. So what's the best monetary policy for the US is not the best monetary policy for the global economy. And I think the latter, the IMF has to push for. I don't see it, but that's, I think, important to keep in mind. About your questions, looking at return on equities for European banks is true. If they have much more buffers, they have a lower return on equity. I don't have a clear answer for that. I wished I would have. I can tell you they should do that or that. So there's a huge restructuring process, of course, going on. The whole banking landscape, everything is changing through fintech, and we will enter a new era, essentially. But having lower return on equity with higher buffers is perhaps bad for the shareholders. Is it bad for society? It's not clear. So it's better to have some higher buffers and avoid some risk. Typically, the private sector has a tendency to have too little buffers. And I agree with you that macroprudential tools not always work, and we have to work with monetary policy as well, as it goes through all the cracks, as Jeremy Stein pointed out famously. But if you look at before the euro crisis, Spain had a very tight macroprudential policy, and they loosened it just before the crisis. And if they would have kept it, it might have helped to avoid the big aspect, the big hit Spain suffered in the euro crisis. So that's my reaction to Fabio. To Gernot, thanks a lot for pushing the climate chapter. So I think it's more than 3 pages, at least as far as I remember. I totally agree that climate change is a big shock. It's not a sequence of small shocks. I still remember when Marty Weitzman came to Princeton to present the first time his Fat Tail paper. That was some while back. And what the book tries to do is to stress the importance of tipping points, and that gives you a different perspective on resilience, because tipping points is exactly the opposite of resilience. Once you hit a tipping point, there's no resilience, no bouncing back. And I also agree that efficiency is encompassing resilience. So essentially, then when you look at the book, there's never a statement saying, oh, we should efficiency, resilience trade-off, because efficiency in a broader sense, if you take it in an economic perspective, in a more formal sense, includes resilience as well. There's a whole dynamic aspect to it. In any dynamic model, the value functions encompass all the bounce back component. So I always very carefully say about cost minimization versus resilience, or cost efficiency versus resilience. But efficiency, I agree, is a broader concept. But dynamic efficiency doesn't need to go with a stochastic model. So there could be also dynamic inefficiencies in a standard deterministic OLG framework. So in the OLG frameworks, overlapping generation models, we often have dynamic inefficiencies, even though there's no talk about resilience because it's not even stochastic. So the dynamic efficiency concept has also some inefficiencies even in a non-stochastic world. And finally, what the book really tries to do is to highlight the importance of tipping points. And that's very much along what Gernot was pushing as well. And the other aspect it tries to push is some timing consistency aspects to it. So there's a clear desire to have a clear path of policy, not to have a volatile path. So you can, if you don't have a clear path of policy, you introduce additional risk, and investors will charge a risk premium for that. And that's an efficiency loss. And so you want to have a clear path, and there are two clear paths. You can have a clear price path or clear quantity path. And you can, trade off these things. But in general, you would like to have a clear path. So ideally, ex ante, you want to commit to a clear path in order to reduce risk premia and make actually more aggressive policies possible. But ex post, you would like to keep the flexibility to readjust depending what you have learned. You might have learned that, oh, we need even a tighter policy. So ex ante, you want to convey to the investors, we have a clear path going forward. Ex post, you want flexibility. And this consistency, this tension, that's outlined in the book between the clear path and keeping some flexibility. And resilience, requires a little bit of flexibility, but you also get more resilience if you have a clear guidance going forward. And you need a right institutional framework to get this time consistency going. And finally, what the book also makes the case that, where the big debate in this in environmental aspects is, should we cut back on growth or should we go for technology option? And what the COVID crisis has shown that, we cut back the economy through the lockdown a lot, but CO2 emissions didn't go down much. Okay, so there's some estimate ranges from estimates, but some estimates are at 5.8% of CO2 emissions and some other larger, but in general, it's minimal. And you cannot imagine to cut back the economy more than the lockdown. So the only solution essentially is to go for technology. And going for technology means innovation, investment, means going into some R&D expenditures, but also means going into some risk and hopefully go into some risk where we can bounce back from if it turns around, if we invest in the wrong technology. And that's essentially what the climate chapter tries to achieve. And, in this sense, the emphasis on the tipping point is very much consistent with Gernot's points. Let me conclude this, and then perhaps we can go to the questions lining up in the chat.
Yes, Markus, thanks for your replies, and I hope I'll get back if Gernot and Fabio have any other reactions. But before we go to the chat, I had a question myself, which is related to the COVID, to which you dedicate a good part of the book. And there were some pandemic plans made after SARS-CoV-1, which have been, of course, employed in Asia with, I think, statistically demonstrable success in terms of limiting excess mortality. But these plans were not equally, utilized. They were also in other parts of the world, and it seems to me that they weren't equally deployed, with the same force. Although a reaction had been made globally to the SARS-CoV-1, in the early 2000s. So to some extent, my question is about the evolution of resilience. So you make various proposals, but it seems that even when we have systems to be resilient to shocks that may be not very predictable, it seems that, we're not very good at putting them in place or, getting them out of the drawer in the right time. Some of these plans, I just want to mention, you mentioned for health vaccines, but some of these plans actually didn't have a vaccine in mind. They had, some other specific measures, including, health protocols to deal, with the pandemic, with drugs and things. And those never came to see the light of day. So I just like your reaction on that. And, how much is it having a plan and how much is having the political will, often independent from industry, to put it in place? And that's my question. And then we'll read the other questions, if you wouldn't mind me taking the liberty to ask a direct question.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So indeed, I think in many countries there were, after SARS-1, there were a lot of committees formed and plans written what to do. And at the end of the day, this was actually ignored by most policymakers when the plans were written, and also later on when they were not really dusted off and then put in place. Nevertheless, I think that's probably the best we can do. I think we can prepare and have some plans in place and then hope that politicians will pick it up. The big challenge is, of course, when these programs are made, it's made in a different environment, and also the political constraints are not fully incorporated. So you often, when you have to put some COVID measures in place, there was quite some pushbacks in many countries. and a different approach. And perhaps the plans were made by a different, when a different party was in charge of the government, there's some mistrust on whether this is the right plan or not. So these are all implementation challenges, but that makes resilience more difficult. But I wouldn't say we should not make these plans. I think we have to just work on it and improve our approach. But I don't have a silver bullet saying, okay, now, we do it this way, and then all the plans will be taken seriously and then just used whenever we need it.
Thanks. That was very clear, and I agree. It's not easy. I have a question here in the chat from Jeremy. Jeremy, are you there? Do you want to ask it yourself, or should I read it? See, your video's off.
Sure, I can ask it myself. I think I'd be curious, Markus, to hear your views on how you see the current international financial architecture now, and where you would want it to be in an ideal world, and basically what is missing between those two visions. So it's basically, I want to push you a little bit more on the specifics of what is missing in the current system to deal with, to improve global resilience, to deal with the tipping points that were mentioned, to deal with future shocks that are of a new kind, and there are many different types of shocks, as you mentioned, and so given this new environment, how far are we from where you would want us to be?
Yeah, so I think the current financial architecture is not very resilient. And let me just point out one thing. It's more on the financial side. It's what you see is the capital flows reacting dramatically to shocks. And of course, you can actually stop it and undo it by policy interventions. But if the policy interventions were not coming, you had big trouble. So ideally, you would like to have an architecture which is self-correcting. So it doesn't require some intervention in order to make sure it doesn't fall apart. And one big challenge is this flight to safety. So there's always this argument that there's too little supply of safe assets. I think it's not really, the problem is not the amount of supply of safe assets, because now we have produced a lot of safe assets. It is the asymmetric supply of safe assets, that the supply comes from certain corners of the world. And if we go into some crisis mode, risk on, risk off mode, then suddenly capital flows go dramatically into the safe asset. And the question is how to counteract this. And one way is to say, okay, we just have to, the advanced economies have to react this way in order to counterbalance it. Another way is to set up a system which does it automatically. And that means the safe asset should be provided not only by some part of the world, but by the whole world. And you might want to generate some global safe asset doing so. And the book outlines this Clause's proposal. Essentially, it's pooling certain amounts of sovereign debt in the emerging economies and tranching them. This way you create also from this global south, you also create some safe asset. And when there's a flight to safety event, there's not only a flight to safety from these emerging economies to the advanced economies, but there's also a flight to safety from the emerging economies into these safe assets from the south. And then this way you automatically channels back some of this flight to safety capital flows. So there are certain ideas you can employ, but this is a more radical proposal, essentially, to make sure that the system is set up in such a way it's self-stabilizing rather than destabilizing, and doesn't rely on policy intervention. Of course, as long as you can trust in total policy intervention, it's fine, but who knows who will be in power in the future. And you would like to have a self-stabilizing system, and that's, I think, would be guaranteeing that. And so that's just one example. And on top of it, you would like to have similar structures in the health and other elements where things are more automatic rather than requiring, policy reaction in a particular way.
We have one more question, and then we'll close, and that's in the chat from Lev Pillay. He's asking, imagine that the fund renames its vulnerability exercise into a resilience exercise. From a Markus perspective, how would it change? I don't know how familiar you are with the vulnerability exercise. It's basically an exercise that the fund does separately for advanced economies and low-income economies, so different groups of income countries, where it uses some models that have inherent stochastic trends, like, for example, house price and so forth. And then it produces, with the addition of some judgment from country desk, some heat maps of where a country is in terms of, being more or less out or far, if you wish, from those trends and those estimated equilibria. So I don't know, this is, out of the hat box, if you have any reaction to that.
At some point, I was a conference at the fund on this issue, and I was there. So in a sense, I think the vulnerability, it's very much as Fabio pointed out earlier. I like the thought to focus on vulnerability. It's a little bit a financial crisis, or typically crisis, a little bit like a heart attacks. It's very hard to predict when the heart attack occurs, but it's, you look at cholesterol and you can get the likelihood. And that's the vulnerability exercise, is a little bit like this. It's to predict the exact timing of a crisis is very hard, but you can say which countries or which are more vulnerable to a crisis. And the vulnerability exercise, I think, is still important. It's a little bit from an ex ante perspective before the crisis happens. A resilience exercise would say, if the crisis happens, how do we have the tools that we can bounce back? So I think you need both. You need a vulnerability exercise, which is the ex ante perspective, where I say, it didn't happen, but let's not get close to, let's get away from the vulnerabilities. And then I said, if we are in a crisis, and ultimately every country is vulnerable, like the COVID crisis. So for any kind of crisis, which we don't know which crisis it will be, how can we make sure that we more easily bounce back? So it's a different exercise, but I think you have to complement the vulnerability exercise with a resilience exercise, which focuses then to crises you cannot avoid, but you manage them to bounce back more quickly.
Thanks. That was, yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to me too. I would like to thank everybody that participated today. Markus, of course, for his great presentation of the book, The Resilient Society, an interesting book with a new take on this concept. Fabio Natalucci from the IMF, and Gernot Wagner, and everybody else who participated. And wish you a great rest of the day, and hope to see you soon again at the IEO seminars.
Thank you from me, especially to Fabio and Gernot and all of you.